Story 1, Blood Meridian. I know that others may have read darker content, but I found my personal limit between it and the road. Story 2, it's long and a heartbreaker, but for me, it has to be East of Eden. If you don't understand the overall message of that story, perhaps you were too young when you read it. Consider reading it again. I will be reading it again soon. Story 3, Lolita has a very dark premise, yet it is one of the most poetically written novels of all time, creating a bizarre juxtaposition. Last Exit to Brooklyn offers a fantastic but exhaustingly depressing glimpse into a world I never wished to be a part of. Story 4, I was reading a book that referred to this one, and I became curious. The 120 Days of Sodom, or The School of Libertinage, describes the activities of four wealthy libertine Frenchmen who spend 4 months seeking ultimate sexual gratification through orgies. They seal themselves in an inaccessible castle in the heart of the Black Forest with 12 accomplices, 20 designated victims, and 10 servants. For aging prostitutes relate stories of their most memorable clients whose sexual practices include a range of disturbing acts. These stories inspire the libertines to engage in acts of increasing violence, leading to the torture and murder of their victims, most of whom are adolescents and young women. I won't be reading that book again for sure. Story 5, The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski tells the story of a young Romani boy who is orphaned and journeys across various parts of Europe during World War II, witnessing many horrific events. Story 6, It's not dark in a gory or taboo way, but Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad excels at portraying what happens to a human mind exposed to nothing but violence, discrimination, and lawlessness in a completely foreign setting. It's quite harrowing to follow Marlowe as he pursues Kurtz into the colonial Congo jungle, only to find Kurtz as a self-defined god among the natives, executing his commands with gruesome nonchalance. The apocalyptic feeling of the mind is particularly evident in the last quarter of the book, and you almost hold your breath until he eventually makes it out. Story 7, The Wasp Factory by the late Ian Banks began my journey of reading all his works. Story 8, Even though it is a memoir and nonfiction, I recently read Night by Elie Wiesel to help my niece with a literature assignment. It is grueling and tragic in its depiction of the Nazi death camps and presents a shockingly honest perspective on how, despite the tales of triumph and heroism from those who lived through the Holocaust, there are also utter depths of despair and loss of humanity that arise when people are subjected to cruel deprivation and control over one another, driven by their objective to survive. Story 9, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo trilogy by Stieg Larsson is really dark. Books 4, 5, and 6 are by a different author and are not as deep as the first 3. Story 10, Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door has left a lasting impression on me. It has been almost a year since I read it, and I still find myself thinking about the horrific story. Story 11, Brave New World, 1984, Fahrenheit 451, and The Handmaid's Tale explore themes that resonate with our present reality. These scenarios can and, in some ways, are occurring. Story 12, I read this book when I was about 15, so it's probably not as bad as I remember, but it was called The Program. Basically, society treats falling in love as an illness, and if it happens to you, they send you to the program to fix you. I remember feeling devastated trying to put myself in the character's shoes. It felt traumatic, but again, I was 15, so I'm not sure I would feel the same way now. Story 13, a book about a Catholic priest is written in an autobiographical style. Halfway through, he begins describing the sexual abuse he experienced as a young boy, but in an inappropriate manner. Following this, he leaves the convent in search of young boys to exploit. I was completely taken aback. The dust jacket merely suggested that it was a story of a priest overcoming his demons. Instead, it revealed a graphic account of how to target and abuse underage boys. I discarded it immediately. Story 14, The Shining. The movie does not do the book justice. There were times I had to set the book down and go outside for a bit. Story 15, The Collector by John Fowles. It was very well written. I cannot deny that. However, it was quite dark. The cover had a butterfly on it, and I kept reading to discover how much he loved butterflies and how he collected them. It was a hard lesson about judging a book by its cover without reading the synopsis. Story 16. The Kindly Ones by Jonathan Little. A well-researched fictional autobiography of an SS officer who joined the SS to avoid being outed as a homosexual. It is a dark exploration of the capacity for evil deeds from otherwise good people. Oh, my human brothers. Let me tell you how it happened. You are not my brother. You will say, but I am. That book led to my short-term alcoholism. Story 17. I read a book once, and I have no idea what it was called. I wish I did. It was about two street kids. The narrator, a boy, was looked after by his older sister. They are completely alone and have no one and nowhere to turn to. It's the ending that has always stuck with me. I found it so sad. It ended with the boy complaining about being hungry and tired of walking while his sister stayed quiet. He noticed that she had been walking in shoes that cut up her feet and hadn't said a word. They got into some kind of incident with the police where she was shot dead. The boy didn't seem to care, but it was more because he had been traumatized and desensitized by life. If anyone recognizes it and remembers the name, I would love to know. Story 18. A collection of short stories titled The Bachman Books by Stephen King deeply affected me when I read it in the early 1980s. Each story was so bleak that I felt depressed for a few days afterward. The Running Man was later adapted into a movie, though not successfully. Rage, the darkest of the stories, later became a reality, and such incidents unfortunately became commonplace. At that time, a student shooting in a school was unheard of. Story 19. Have you all read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? Not the movie, either Gene or Johnny, but the book. Go on, I'll wait. Story 20. Cadaver Exquisito, titled Tender is the Flesh in English, is written by Augustina Bazterrica. Tender is the Flesh portrays a society in which a virus has contaminated all animal meat. Due to the lack of animal flesh, cannibalism becomes legal. Marcos, a human meat supplier, is conflicted by this new society and tormented by his personal losses. Story 21. The Heart is Deceitful Above All Things by J.T. Leroy. I finished the book while at a cafe. I placed it on a table, pushed it away from me, and walked out without it. Story 22. We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lionel Shriver, where a mother tries to come to terms with the heinous crimes of her son. I read it upon its release over 20 years ago, and it still sends shivers down my spine. Story 23. I can't remember the title, but it was written by Bret Easton Ellis about a serial killer. It gave me nightmares, and I thought law enforcement should be looking into this individual. Story 24. The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum was a challenging read. It depicted a young girl enduring horrific torture. Finishing the book made me question my own sense of morality. While I acknowledge that others may have darker and more gruesome stories to tell, I personally found this book intolerable. Story 25. Blood Meridian and the Road by Cormac McCarthy vividly illustrate the depths of human evil, particularly in times of desperation. Story 26. Night by Elie Wiesel is a Holocaust memoir that deeply affected me when I read it in high school. Story 27. Death's End is the final book in the Three Body Problem trilogy. It may not be the darkest, but it left me with existential terror for months. Story 28. We Need to Talk About Kevin. It scared me so much that I finished reading it in my room, then went into the living room and asked my roommates if we could watch a funny movie. They were like, of course. Story 29. Mindhunter and the following books by the same two authors delve into the psyche of serial killers and similar topics. There are some dark aspects in there. Everyone loved Mindhunter, the television show, but I don't think people fully considered those themes. Story 30. The Wool and Silo series and the Mechanical series. Obviously, Handmaid's Tale. Maybe The House of Leaves, The Abyssal Plane, but it may be a story collection. It's been a while. Game of Thrones may be more, but I skipped it as I was engaged in other series and couldn't spare the mental energy to add another that required a different lifestyle for reading. I'm sure there are many worse. I like horror, dystopian science fiction, and steampunk, but I avoid those that are consistently and utterly without hope. Story 31. The Road by Cormac McCarthy shook me, and I could not stop thinking about it, which was disturbing. Story 32. Johnny Got His Gun Made Me a Pro-Veteran and Anti-War Teenager. It's what One by Metallica is based on. The lyrics are from the book. Story 33. I think it was called A Child Called It. I read it when I was younger. It is about a boy growing up in an abusive household. It is very insightful but also quite sad and gave me a whole new perspective. Story 34. I believe Stephen King was one of the darkest authors. There are elements in his work that cannot be effectively portrayed on screen by any director. I encounter things in the real world that still remind me of that book. Pet Sematary was not any more uplifting. Story 35. I'm unsure if it has been translated, but Exodes by Jean-Marc Ligny is a French novel where climate change leads the world to a state where humanity is truly at the brink of extinction. It features Death Eaters, fire maniacs, and wealthy individuals in bubbles, waiting to die in their jacuzzis. It feels strikingly realistic. Story 36. Probably The Boy in Striped Pajamas. It was sad and definitely opened my eyes about World War II and the Holocaust. Story 37. I am sure there are much darker works out there, but All Quiet on the Western Front stands out to me as particularly bleak. It did not help that I powered through the entire book in one day, as it left me feeling gutted and hollow. It took me a couple of days to get over that, and the whole experience has really stuck with me. Story 38. A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini. This author knows how to write deeply emotional stories. It just keeps escalating in intensity. Please read this book. Story 39. I read The Stand just as the COVID lockdown started, and it felt a bit too close to home at the time. Story 40. Not a novel in its entirety, especially since it is a children's fiction book, but the opening of Red Rising features a scene that will always stick with me. There is a slave execution on Mars, but since the gravity is less than that of Earth and the slaves are so stocky, their next of kin must pull down on their legs hard enough to snap their neck in the noose. Otherwise, they just hang there, almost choking, until they starve to death weeks later. Story 41. I once started reading Dracula but stopped because my translation was poor. Here are some other books I have read or am currently reading that are dark in their own way. Mephisto, Blood of Eden. Story 42. The Trial by Franz Kafka. Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Good as Gold by Joseph Heller. Lose Hope All Who Enter Here. Story 43. Child of God by Cormac McCarthy. Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. The Road by Cormac McCarthy. Story 44. The Shining. The book was scarier for me than the film, although I already knew the story when I watched the movie. The story had great tension throughout, and I couldn't put the book down, but I also wanted to put it down and get somewhere safe. Story 45. The good assassin Mossad agents hunt down a notorious Nazi from Latvia, and the details of his crimes prevented me from eating dinner that night. I have read many war books, and this one was the darkest. Story 46. Ma Mère, Georges Bataille. You will find very little information about it online, and that is probably for the best. This work is disturbing. Story 47. Helter Skelter really affected me. I was 19 or 20 years old when I read it for the first time. This was in the mid-1980s, and knowing that Charles Manson had that type of influence on people, along with the possibility of him being paroled within his lifetime, was unsettling. Story 48. In Memoriam by Alice Wynne. That novel is still fresh in my mind, even after finishing it about a year ago. The absolute, unfiltered brutality described in the novel is incredible. It truly conveys the dread and horror of being on the front lines in a war fought by young individuals. Story 49. I read a book in jail that I can't remember the name of. I think it was about a door. The entire family was involved in inappropriate relationships, including the father and daughter and the mother and son. The daughter and son were also engaged in sexual activities with each other. There was all kinds of physical and emotional abuse. It was really disturbing. At one point, I was ready to stop reading, but I skipped to the end. The little girl ended up pouring lighter fluid under her parents' bedroom door and burning the house down, which redeemed the story a little, so I did finish reading it. In the end, The two children walked away to start a life together. It was shocking, especially to find that book in jail. Story 50. I Was Doris Suarez by Derek Raymond is the fourth book in a series of bleak, existentialist noir crime novels featuring a haunted, unnamed detective in 1980s London, working in the unexplained deaths division. The story follows his quest to find a serial killer who targets young women with AIDS. It is as cheerful as it sounds. Story 51. Portrait of a Young Man Drowning by Charles Perry. Story 52. During my school years, I read several novels that I considered dark while in Denmark from around 7th to 10th grade. Just a Prank is about two brothers who accidentally kill another child due to an amputation. The situation could have been humorous, but it ultimately becomes quite dark. Another novel is called American Oil, which tells the story of a young teenager, around 17 years old, who attempts to assassinate a random president and then plans to kill himself afterward. He is stopped by a homeless woman who reveals that she has previously done something similar to her boss, a notorious pervert, by putting American oil in his coffee, causing him to have a severe reaction while driving on the highway, leading to his crash and death. Just when she thinks she is free from sexual harassment, the person who takes her boss's place turns out to be little better. The message in this story seems to be that even when resorting to extreme measures, some things remain unchanged. I must admit, Danish schools can be quite intense with the material students are required to watch and read, with one of my worst experiences being nothing. This story features 8th grade students engaging in abominable actions, including one who rapes another 8th grade girl, another who is forced to dig up their deceased unborn brother in a graveyard, and the girl who is raped ultimately carves the head off a dog. Truly horrific, if you ask me. Story 53. Matterhorn by Karl Marlantes is an astounding novel about the Vietnam War. Bleak and visceral, it conjures vivid images of the hardships endured in that conflict. Additionally, Unit 731 and the Rape of Nanking evoke nightmarish themes that are challenging to confront. Story 54. Firefly by Piers Anthony is unsettling, and I didn't finish reading it. Trigger warning for pedophilia, presented in a way that many offenders use to justify the child wanting it. This has tainted my view of the author, and reflecting on his other novels and his close friendships with young female fans feels inappropriate. Story 55. Obscure one at best. The Life We Bury by Alan Eskens. If you want a straightforward mystery with some pulpiness, here you go. The description of the desecration of the victim's body was brutally honest. Again, it is an obscure novel but a quick and enjoyable read, in my humble opinion. Don't expect greatness, however. Story 56. Most recently, I would say The Bone Collector by Jeffrey Deaver and The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters. The Bone Collector is a crime thriller, while The Little Stranger is a horror novel. However, The Little Stranger takes a while to build up the horror, which can turn some readers away. It's a slow burn, but I found it worth the read. The Bone Collector, on the other hand, engages you immediately, but if you don't enjoy crime thrillers or find forensic analysis uninteresting, it may not be for you. Story 57. Let the Right One In is a bone-chilling vampire novel. There are 2 movie adaptations, with the Swedish version being quite faithful to the book. Story 58. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omilas is a short story that explores deep themes. Another notable short story is The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. Both are quick reads and contain unsettling elements. Story 59. Maybe not as dark as some, but we need to talk about Kevin. The way the mother speaks about her son is unsettling and makes it challenging to get through the story. Story 60. The Sound, a short story by Italian writer Stefano Masserin, is part of the Cannibal generation. Its narration is unsettling and left me stunned. I read it as a young adult, and I'm uncertain if it would have the same impact today, almost 30 years later, due to our increased exposure to disturbing content online. Additionally, The Outsider by H.P. Lovecraft describes the feeling of horror for oneself so well that it, along with The Stranger by Albert Camus and The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, is one of the most intimate stories to me. Story 61. Hard to Say 1. The Bell Jar, Blood Meridian, The Girl Next Door, Apt Pupil. These come to mind. Story 62. The Outsider by Stephen King is an intriguing book. However, it quickly declined in quality, similar to falling off a cliff. Story 63. Jude the Obscure is my favorite. Honorable mentions include The Road, The Stand, and Last Exit to Brooklyn. Story 64. The darkest book I've read was probably Desperation by Stephen King. I know it's quite basic, but I haven't read much in a few years. I really want to read Tender is the Flesh, though. Story 65. Blood Meridian was the only book I read where I needed to take a break because the descriptions of violence became too intense. Story 66. Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke by Eric LaRocca. I am surprised that this hasn't been mentioned at all. I also wouldn't recommend reading this if you plan to eat later, particularly meat. Story 67. Incantation by Alice Hoffman is about a girl whose family are covert Jews posing as Catholics during the Spanish Inquisition. I remember reading it as a child. It's a middle-grade book, and I found it genuinely disturbing. There is shocking violence depicted in a simple, straightforward way that highlights the creativity of human brutality. One scene that has stayed with me for years is when her grandfather, who doesn't eat pork according to kosher laws, is placed in a piece of headgear that clamps around his jaw and winches shut. The inquisitors force pork into his mouth and tighten the winch until his teeth crack and his jaw breaks, all while the forbidden food is in his mouth. I think my 11-year-old self had to put the book down for a moment. There are other, more brutal examples of violence in the book, but I was really struck by the pointedness of the cruelty. Story 68. The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump and his ghostwriter discusses unsettling topics that will challenge your understanding of humanity and the malevolent forces around us. Story 69. The Stand is the only book that has ever given me nightmares. This is separate from some of the saddest scenes in the expanded version, including the scattered survivors who don't make it due to various circumstances. The small children who are not old enough to survive on their own and are not found in time truly break my heart. Swan Song by Robert McCammon was also a difficult and dark read. Story 70. Not Wanted on the Voyage by Timothy Finley is brilliant, funny, and heartbreakingly bleak. I never want to read it again. Story 71. A bored wealthy man enters a secret society where he can make any fantasy come true, no matter how extreme, for a certain amount of money. However, there are rules and the cost of breaking them is limitless. This is from Patrick Senecal. Additionally, in Sur le Soul, a successful author loses his sanity when his horror novels come to life. Story 72. I read the first 35 chapters of Oyasumi Punpun, and that was more than enough for me. I'm not curious at all. Story 73. Martin Eden by Jack London was recommended to me, and I had no idea what to expect. That book stayed with me for a long time. Until reading this, I had thought Jack London only wrote stories about dogs. Story 74. The Bunker Diary is told through the perspective of a teenager who is kidnapped by an unknown figure and forced to live in an underground bunker with several others, including a 9-year-old girl. Eventually, everyone dies except for him and the girl, who starves to death in his arms after their captor cuts off electricity and stops sending down food and water. The last page reiterates, flesh and blood, meat and drink. It scared me to death as a kid. Story 75. The Axis trilogy, also known as The Wayfarer Redemption, by Sarah Douglas is relatively tame compared to some other books. However, it had a significant impact on me as a teenager, featuring some disturbing content that has stayed with me for over 20 years. Story 76. Blue Rose by Peter Straub. I wasn't ready for it, and it triggered me. I couldn't get the story out of my head for weeks. Edit. Sorry, I misread the question. Blue Rose is a short story. The novel is A Child Called It. I read that at a young age too, and I kind of wish I hadn't. Story 77. The Dark King. The setting is similar to Attack on Titan, but the main character experiences much more agony, both physical and mental. Story 78. I read it over 10 years ago, but there was something about Worm that was dark and unsettling. The way the powers worked, the passengers, and the troubling aspects of Eidolon's powers giving him what he needed. The wretch that Amy created and Bonesaw contributed to a world that is the stuff of nightmares. It's a shame the novel had a young adult structure. Some parts were quite cringeworthy, especially in the middle chapters. Story 79, Blood Meridian. Once were warriors. The damage done. The North Water. The Rape of Nanking. All excellent reads and dark in their own way. Story 80, Haunted by Chuck Palahniuk. I haven't read many really dark books, but that one is quite disturbing. Story 81. I read a lot of splatterpunk horror, and Into the Wolf's Den by John Athan is one of my favorites. However, approach it at your own risk. Additionally, I recall The Perks of Being a Wallflower, which seems like a fairy tale compared to Into the Wolf's Den from my teenage years. It gets really dark towards the end. Story 82. There's a banned book called Boy that my Japanese friend read. It is an autobiography of a murderer and is considered a very disturbing read. Story 83. Another Now by Yanis Varoufakis. Not in the sense that you mean, but knowing that we stray further from something decent and rational that everyone would grasp, yet it slips away like water. Moreover, no one can see the water in the first place. Story 84. American Psycho made me glance around several times, just in case someone could somehow see what I was reading. That is some twisted writing. It makes the movie look fun and bubbly by comparison. Story 85. There's only one dark moment that stands out for me, and it's Charles Bukowski's Post Office, where he admits to assaulting a woman while doing his rounds. Story 86. Verity by Colleen Hoover made me very sad when she realized that they killed her for something she didn't do. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.